We're starting to hit a busy time in the NEVI program, and some patterns are starting to form. First off, I want to start with a quote from John Markowitz, the head of e-mobility at the New York Power Authority. He was on a live stream with me, hosted by Steve at Plug and Play EV, the Coast to Coast EV live stream that we do every other week. Excuse me. The quote is, "Target places where the private sector would never go." And it was a very interesting interview, which I'll link down below in the description. New York started a program before NEVI was a thing that has been speculated has some bearing on how the NEVI program developed. I asked him directly if any staff he knew or whether there was any citation that the federal government plan was somewhat based on the New York plan, and he said no, but the similarities are very uncanny. So I think there is at least some review of the federal government that they did of the New York program. And as such, the state of New York was ahead of the game with the NEVI program because they had already started builds on corridors with what were mostly NEVI compliant stations because they had already begun the process. Now that puts them in an advantageous situation, which I'm going to explain in just a second. These are what are known as alternative fuel corridors for the state of North Carolina. Everything in blue here is an alternative fuel corridor. And the way the NEVI program works, it comes in phases. The funding from the federal government is released in phases. You don't get phase 2 funding until you've met the requirements of phase 1. And phase 1 requirements are that there must be a NEVI station every 50 miles on the alternative fuel corridors, which in the state of North Carolina is shown right here. You can see there's quite a few of them. And so that's a pretty daunting feat. And some states might already have locations that are NEVI compliant. For instance, Electrify America stations, because the NEVI compliance of CCS handles, and also at least 4 handles providing 150 kilowatts each. There are other requirements, but that's basically what you would expect from a NEVI station, are already in place. So going back to John's quote, target the places where the private sector would never go. So when you're going to put in a station as a state authority, what you want to do is look at your alternative fuel corridors and put in stations that the commercial or the private sector is not going to build into. Like the private sector in the state of North Carolina, you can assume that Charlotte, Raleigh, Winston-Salem, and Asheville are all going to get builds, and the Interstate 95, which is this one right here, are all going to get builds by private sector because it's high traffic and EV adoption is higher, so they're trying to recoup from putting in a station in a location where data says that they'll be able to make a profit. But out here on the coast, there's fewer people, lower EV adoption, and so that's where John is suggesting that you target your stations. Now, the state of North Carolina, let's go ahead and go forward. This is what the state of Iowa's alternative fuels corridors look like. And if you compare that to North Carolina has many more alternative fuel corridors than the state of Iowa. And I'm not sure exactly the miles of these, like if you totaled up the miles in Iowa and you totaled up the miles in North Carolina, I'm not sure what that would be, but the state of North Carolina is probably a little bit bigger and they have more alternative fuel corridors because they're part of that East Coast travel sector. Okay, so this is what it looks like for the state of North Carolina, and there was this graphic up here that was released several years ago. I actually had this graphic printed out, and it was on the bottom of my monitor for about a year. Everything in blue is an existing NEVI compliant station. So as I said, you could see in Asheville, there's a Electrify America station. In Charlotte, there's Electrify America station. So these orange ones are the ones that they would have to do in order to complete phase 1 of NEVI. But that's not what happened. Over here on the left-hand side is the actual NEVI awards. There's 9 of them. And basically what they are Wilmington, New Bern, and the next 4 up here on this one corridor. So also, they are building this orange one here on the north end of Charlotte. They're putting this one in up here, and they're putting this one in up here. But all the other ones they are not putting in phase one. And the reason being is because they also have money from the Volkswagen Dieselgate fund that they're using in order to build additional stations. So for instance, this orange dot over here is getting built with Volkswagen Dieselgate funds. There's another one in here that's getting built with Volkswagen Dieselgate funds. There was this one right here was built with Volkswagen Dieselgate funds, and I think up here was also Volkswagen Dieselgate funds. So what they did is they have a pool of money from Volkswagen Dieselgate, and they chose locations in order to fill in alternative fuel corridor holes that the private sector was not going to do, and that they were holding the money for, because once you finish phase one, you have additional money allocated for your state that you could use for phase two, and you have more leniency and independent direction on where phase two charging can go. So it's advantageous for you if you could do as little in phase one as possible. And the pot of money for phase two is really what you have much more discretion on where you're going to put the chargers. So that's really how this plays out. And as you see, there's 9 here. Now let's go to Iowa. Iowa has 28 stations that they needed to do in order to build out their alternative fuel corridor requirements for NEVI requirements, which is a NEVI station every 50 miles along the alternative fuel corridors before they can move to phase two. Iowa does not have as much private sector investment. They haven't done as good of a job with the Dieselgate, nor like in the state of New York, where they started many years ago using state funds in order to build out a NEVI-like program, do they have the infrastructure in order to compete. So a lot of the money that is allocated for the state of Iowa is being dedicated to phase one requirements, basically the alternative fuel corridors. And then these underserved areas outside of the alternative fuel corridors are not going to have as much money allocated to them. So basically that's how this game works. I know that EV nerds that are into the NEVI rollout are familiar with this, but I suspect that most people are not. And so as the states start doing their NEVI announcements, one thing you want to watch for in phase one announcements is how many announcements do they have? Because basically that tells you how good of a strategy they've had leading up to this situation, and how much private investment is going to be footing the bill to complete phase one for the state, so they have more discretionary spending with their NEVI funds in phase two. Anyway, hope you found this interesting, and thank you very much for watching.